The winter of 2018 in Toronto was a season of bone-chilling revelations. A biting wind swept through the affluent neighborhood of Leaside, rattling the bare branches of dormant trees. On a secluded property on Mallory Crescent, the silence was broken by the heavy rhythmic thud of shovels striking frozen earth. Forensic teams in white suits gathered around large decorative planters, vessels that had once showcased vibrant summer blooms. But as the ice gave way, a horrific harvest was unearthed. Beneath layers of potting soil lay the fragmented remains of men who had disappeared from the city's vibrant village over the span of 8 years. The man responsible was no shadowy monster, but a genial 60-year-old grandfather and sought-after landscaper. Bruce McArthur hadn't just been tending to the gardens of Toronto's elite, he had been using them as a graveyard. For nearly a decade, he hid his crimes in plain sight, turning beautiful backyards into a meticulously curated house of horrors. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story of Bruce McArthur is a chilling lesson in the danger of a facade. The way a person can build a life so ordinary that it becomes a perfect camouflage for the unthinkable. To his clients, his friends, and even his family, Bruce was the embodiment of reliability, a man whose life seemed to follow the predictable, slow-moving trajectory of a well-tended garden. He was born in October 1951 and raised in the rural landscape of Argyll, Ontario, a place where traditional values and hard work were the currency of respect. His upbringing was rooted in the strict religious atmosphere of a farm, which perhaps contributed to the rigid emotional walls he would later build around his true self. In his early adulthood, McArthur played the part of the quintessential family man with practiced precision. He married his wife in the 1970s, and for decades, they raised 2 children in the quiet suburbs of Oshawa. Those who knew him then described a man who was perhaps a bit reserved, but fundamentally nice. He worked as a traveling salesman for a major clothing company, a job that required him to be personable, persuasive, and, above all, forgettable in a crowd. He was the man in the sensible suit, carrying a briefcase, making small talk about the weather and the local sports teams. There was nothing in his demeanor to suggest that beneath the surface, a predatory darkness was slowly taking root. The first major fracture in this carefully constructed mask appeared in the late 1990s. The business of being a traveling salesman was changing, and the financial pressures began to mount, eventually leading McArthur to declare bankruptcy. But the internal shift was even more profound. After decades of living as a heterosexual husband and father, McArthur began to explore his identity as a gay man. This transition was not a quiet one. In the early 2000s, he separated from his wife and moved to Toronto, eventually settling in the heart of the city. He didn't just move to a new apartment, he moved into a new life, one that allowed him to finally step into the vibrant, diverse community of the village at Church and Wellesley. It was during this period of reinvention that McArthur found his second calling: landscaping. He founded a small company called Artistic Design. The name itself was a reflection of how he saw himself, not just a man who cut grass, but a creator of beauty and order. Landscaping was the perfect profession for a man with his specific psychological needs. It allowed him to work alone or with minimal supervision. It gave him a reason to drive a large, nondescript white van through every corner of the city without drawing a second glance. Most importantly, it gave him access to the private spaces of Toronto's elite, the backyards and gated gardens where people felt most secure. To his wealthy clients in neighborhoods like Leaside and Rosedale, Bruce was a gentle giant. He was the silver-haired, slightly portly grandfather figure who arrived with a smile and a trunk full of perennials. He was the kind of contractor you didn't just hire, you trusted. He had the keys to their gates. He knew the layout of their properties, and he knew when they would be away on vacation. He was meticulously organized, keeping detailed logs of his plantings and the materials he used. This same attention to detail, this obsession with order, would later be revealed as the hallmark of his more sinister activities. He was a man who understood that if you bury something deep enough and cover it with something beautiful, people will only see the flowers. By the mid-2000s, McArthur had become a fixture in the gay community. He was a regular at the local bars, often seen sitting quietly with a drink, observing the younger men. He was known as Santa, or the Grandpa, because of his friendly, non-threatening appearance. He was active on dating apps like Silver Daddies and Scruff, where his profile projected the image of a kind, mature man looking for connection. He would often mention his children and grandchildren, using them as a shield to prove his normality. No one suspected that the man who spoke so warmly about his family was the same man who was meticulously documenting the lives of the men he intended to destroy. The psychological profile that would later emerge was one of a controlled serial killer, a man who did not kill out of sudden, uncontrollable rage, but out of a deeply ingrained, ritualistic need for power. McArthur was a predator who understood the value of patience. He didn't rush his victims. He cultivated them. He looked for men who occupied the cracks in society, immigrants who were not yet settled, men struggling with addiction, or those whose disappearances might be easily explained away by a lifestyle choice. He was a student of human vulnerability, and he used his grandfatherly persona to lure them into a sense of safety. In the village, he was a ghost, a man who moved through the crowds without leaving an impression. In the gardens of Leaside, he was a craftsman, a man who brought life to the soil. These two identities were kept strictly separate, yet they were inextricably linked. The income from his landscaping business funded his life in the city, while the properties of his clients provided the ultimate concealment for his dark hobby. He was a man living a double life that was so seamless, so perfectly executed, that it lasted for nearly a decade. He was the gardener of death, tending to a hidden harvest that no one, not even the police who patrolled his hunting grounds, dared to believe existed. To understand the tragedy that unfolded between 2010 and 2018, one must first step into the heart of Toronto's Church and Wellesley neighborhood, known simply as the Village. Historically, this enclave served as a sanctuary, a place where those rejected by traditional society could find community, love, and a sense of belonging. The streets are lined with rainbow flags, bustling patios, and historic brick buildings that have witnessed decades of activism and celebration. It is a place of high energy, especially during the summer months when the air is thick with music and the spirit of pride. Yet, like any dense urban center, the Village also has its shadows, quiet corners and transient populations that move through the neon lights unnoticed. Bruce McArthur did not just visit the Village, he became a part of its background noise. He was the unassuming older man who could be found at Maggie's or the Black Eagle, often leaning against the bar with a beer in hand, watching the world go through its paces. In a community that often prioritizes youth and beauty, McArthur was the Silver Daddy, a figure who projected stability and paternal warmth. For many of the men he targeted, this persona was an irresistible draw. He wasn't looking for the spotlight, he was looking for the vulnerable. He was a predator who understood that the best place to hide is in the middle of a crowd. The men who would eventually become names on a police manifest were not chosen at random. McArthur was a meticulous student of human invisibility. He sought out men who lived on the margins of the community, those who inhabited the cracks, where the light of social safety nets rarely reached. Many of his victims were of Middle Eastern or South Asian descent. Men like Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, and Majid Kaihan. These were individuals navigating the complex intersections of their cultural heritage and their sexual identity. Some were new immigrants, still struggling to find their footing in a foreign land. Others were closeted, living double lives to protect their families or their status in the community. McArthur knew that if these men went missing, their families might not immediately report it to the authorities, and the authorities, in turn, might not look very hard for them. This was the core of McArthur's hunting strategy. He utilized the digital landscape of the 21st century with the same cold precision he used to prune a hedge. He was a frequent user of dating apps like Silver Daddies and Scruff, platforms where he could filter his searches for specific physical types and vulnerabilities. His profiles were masterpieces of normality. He spoke of his love for the outdoors, his career as a landscaper, and his role as a grandfather. He would engage in long, patient conversations, building a rapport and a sense of trust before ever suggesting a meeting. By the time a victim agreed to step into his white work van, they felt they were meeting a friend. not a monster. The van itself was an essential tool in his macabre toolkit. A white 2003 GMC Safari, it was the ultimate urban camouflage. To a passerby, it was just another contractor's vehicle, perhaps filled with mulch, shovels, and flats of begonias. But inside, it was a mobile chamber of horrors. McArthur had customized the interior, creating a space where he could restrain his victims away from prying eyes. He would lure them to secluded spots or back to his own apartment on Thorncliffe Park Drive, a high-rise building that offered the anonymity of thousands of neighbors living in close proximity. In that apartment, surrounded by the mundane trappings of a quiet life, pictures of his grandchildren, books on gardening, the grandfather of the village would reveal his true face. The psychological warfare McArthur waged was subtle. He didn't just take lives, he erased them. He took advantage of the transient reputation of the gay community, a stereotype that suggests men often drift in and out of lives, moving away for work or personal reasons without warning. He used this bias to his advantage. When Skandaraj Navaratnam vanished in September 2010, many simply assumed he had moved on. He was a popular figure, a social butterfly, and his sudden absence was felt, but not immediately investigated as a crime. The same pattern followed with Abdul Basir Faizi in late 2010 and Majid Kaihan in 2012. These men didn't just disappear, they were systematically removed from the social fabric of the village by a man who knew exactly how to make a person seem like a ghost. McArthur's work was not just about the act of killing, it was about the power of the secret. He enjoyed the fact that he was the only one who knew where these men were. He would return to the village day after day, week after week, standing in the same bars where his victims once laughed, perhaps even speaking to their friends. He lived for the thrill of being the wolf in the fold, the gardener who knew that the most beautiful blooms were fed by the darkness beneath the soil. He watched as the community began to whisper about a serial killer, and he watched as the police held press conferences to tell the public there was no evidence of such a thing. The village was more than just a location for McArthur. It was a resource. He treated the men there like annuals in a garden, things to be admired for a season and then discarded when they no longer served his purpose. He relied on the systemic biases of the time, the idea that a missing immigrant or a closeted gay man was lesser than in the eyes of the law. He bet his life on the fact that the world would look at him and see a harmless old man, and then look at his victims and see people who had simply decided to move away. For 8 long years, that bet paid off. The horror of Bruce McArthur's reign of terror lay not just in its brutality, but in its chilling consistency. Over the span of 8 years, he established a routine of erasure that turned the vibrant lives of men into mere digital ghosts and physical echoes. He was a man who understood that in a city as large as Toronto, a person doesn't need to be hidden in a remote forest to disappear. They just need to be stripped of their context. McArthur's method was a slow, agonizing process of cultivation and harvest, where Day X was not a single moment, but a recurring nightmare that the community felt but could not name. The pattern began in earnest on September 6, 2010. Skandaraj Navaratnam, a 40-year-old man known to his friends as Skanda, was a fixture in the village. He was charismatic, a talented dancer, and a man who worked hard as a dishwasher while nurturing deep social ties. He was last seen leaving Zippers, a popular local bar, with an older man. That man was Bruce McArthur. In the days that followed, Skanda's absence was a deafening silence. He left behind a puppy he adored, a clear sign to those who knew him that he hadn't simply walked away from his life. But to the outside world, he was just another name on a missing persons poster that would eventually be weathered by the rain and forgotten. Only months later, in late December 2010, the pattern repeated. Abdul Basir Faizi, a 44-year-old husband and father who worked as a printer, told his family he was going out with co-workers. He never returned. His car was found abandoned in the Moore Park area, a neighborhood where McArthur often worked as a landscaper. Then, in October 2012, Majid Kaihan, 58, vanished. Like the others, he had ties to the village but lived a life that was complicated by the expectations of his family and culture. These three men formed the initial harvest, men of color, some with precarious social or legal standing, whose disappearances failed to trigger the urgent, citywide alarm that a serial predator was on the loose. McArthur's Day X for each victim likely followed a grimly similar script. He would lure them to his apartment or a secluded work site under the guise of an intimate encounter. Once they were vulnerable, often restrained as part of a sexual game they believed was consensual, the grandpa persona would evaporate. He used his physical strength and the tools of his trade to overpower them. There were no screams heard through the thin walls of his high-rise apartment. There were no struggles that left behind a mess. He was a professional who knew how to handle materials. He treated the human body with the same cold detachment he applied to a bag of mulch or a length of cedar. After the life had been extinguished, McArthur began his most macabre ritual, the documentation. He was an obsessive collector of trophies. On his computer, investigators would later find folders meticulously organized by victim name. He would pose the bodies, often dressing them in a fur-lined coat or placing a cigar in their mouths, and take photographs. This was the ultimate expression of his power. He wasn't just a killer. He was a director, a curator of death. He wanted to preserve the moment he turned a living, breathing human being into an object that he owned. These digital files were his secret garden, a place he could revisit whenever he felt the need to reclaim that sense of absolute control. Then came the disposal, a term that feels too sanitary for the reality of his actions. McArthur would use his landscaping equipment to dismember the remains. This was done with a clinical precision that avoided drawing attention. He didn't dump the remains in a landfill where they might be discovered by a stray dog or a city worker. Instead, he chose the very places where his presence was most expected, the backyards of his clients. At 13 Mallory Crescent, a sprawling property owned by friends who allowed him to store his equipment there, he began a terrifying project. He would place the remains in large, heavy, decorative planters, the kind used for ornamental trees or large shrubs. He would layer them with soil, sometimes planting flowers or greenery on top, to hide the smell and the sight. He was literally building his graveyard into the landscape of one of Toronto's wealthiest neighborhoods. The brilliance of this plan was its invisibility. Who would ever suspect the friendly, hard-working gardener of carrying human remains in the back of his van? When he arrived at a job site with bags of soil and heavy pots, he was greeted with smiles and offered glasses of water. He was a man doing his job. He would spend hours meticulously tending to the earth, all while the people he worked for sat just a few feet away, oblivious to the fact that their beautiful garden was a tomb. This was McArthur's greatest triumph, the ability to make his crimes part of the scenery. As the years passed, the Day X events became more frequent, and the victims became more diverse. Soroush Mahmoodi vanished in 2015. Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, an asylum seeker from Sri Lanka who was not even reported missing because he had no family in the city, disappeared in early 2016. Dean Lisowick, a homeless man who frequented the downtown core, was taken in late 2016. Then came Salim Essen in April 2017. With each disappearance, McArthur's confidence grew. He believed he was untouchable. He had mastered the art of vanishing people in plain sight, and he had learned that as long as he chose his plants carefully, the world wouldn't bother to look beneath the surface. The vanishing patterns were not just about the men who disappeared, but about the silence that followed. McArthur relied on the fact that these men lived in the periphery. He knew that the police would likely categorize their disappearances as lifestyle choices or voluntary departures. He understood that the media wouldn't obsess over a missing immigrant or a homeless man the way they would a young white student. He was a predator who understood the politics of empathy, and he used that knowledge to ensure that his patterns remained invisible to everyone except the community that was being systematically hunted. By the early 2000s, a heavy, suffocating atmosphere had begun to settle over Toronto's village. It wasn't just the cold winter air or the usual urban grit. It was a growing, gnawing realization that men were vanishing. In a community where everyone knew everyone, or at least recognized the regulars at the bars and cafes. The absences were becoming impossible to ignore. Friends would look for Skandaraj Navaratnam at Zippers and find only an empty stool. They would ask about Abdulbasir Faizi and receive only shrugs. The missing posters began to proliferate, taped to telephone poles and tucked into the windows of shops along Church Street, their edges curling in the wind. This was the beginning of the community's cry, a desperate attempt to force the world to see what the gardener was so carefully burying. The friction between the LGBTQ+ community and the Toronto Police Service, TPS, became a central theme of this period. For years, activists and residents had been sounding the alarm, insisting that a serial predator was hunting in their midst. They pointed to the similarities in the disappearances: men of color, many with ties to the same social circles, vanishing without a trace. But for a long time, these warnings were met with a wall of institutional skepticism. The prevailing narrative from the authorities was often dismissive. They suggested that the men might have simply decided to move away to start new lives, perhaps to escape the pressures of being closeted or to seek better opportunities elsewhere. In their eyes, without a body or a crime scene, there was no proof of a killer. To the community, this felt like a betrayal, a sign that their lives were considered less worthy of a thorough investigation. In response to the mounting pressure, the Toronto Police eventually launched Project Houston in November 2012. This task force was specifically designed to investigate the disappearances of Navaratnam, Faizi, and Majid Kayhan. For 18 months, detectives delved into the lives of the missing men. They interviewed hundreds of people, tracked cell phone records, and even looked into Bruce McArthur. In fact, McArthur was interviewed by police during this time because he had been linked to some of the men through dating apps and social circles. However, at that point, he was seen as just one of many associates. He played his part perfectly, the helpful, slightly bewildered older man who couldn't imagine what had happened to his friends. Because there was no forensic evidence tying him to a crime, and because he didn't fit the stereotypical profile of a bloodthirsty killer, the police moved on. Project Houston was eventually shuttered in 2014 with no arrests and no clear answers. The police publicly stated that there was no evidence of a serial killer, a statement that landed like a blow to the heart of the village. The closure of the task force sent a chilling message to Bruce McArthur. He was invisible. He continued his work, both as a landscaper and a predator, with a renewed sense of impunity. While the police retreated, the rumors in the community only intensified. People began to warn each other about the white van and to be careful on dating apps. The fear became a part of daily life, a low-frequency hum of anxiety that influenced where people went and who they talked to. The search for the missing men became a grassroots effort. Friends and family members organized their own search parties, scouring parks and ravines and keeping the names of the vanished alive on social media. They refused to let the vanishing patterns become permanent. They held vigils, lighting candles in the heart of the village, their flickering flames a symbol of defiance against the encroaching darkness. They were fighting not just for their friends, but for their right to be protected by the society they lived in. This was a period of profound social echo, where the failure of the system to act created a deep rift that would take years to heal. The atmosphere in the village during these years was one of calculated silence from the killer and shouted desperation from the residents. McArthur would often be seen at the very vigils held for his victims, standing at the back of the crowd, his face a mask of solemn concern. He watched the grief he had caused, perhaps even drawing a sick sense of satisfaction from the fact that he was the secret architect of their pain. He was the Santa who brought only sorrow, the grandpa who had stolen their brothers and sons. He was so deeply embedded in the community that he was able to monitor the investigation from the inside, adjusting his behavior to stay one step ahead of the few detectives who were still quietly paying attention. The turning point wouldn't come until several years later, but the foundation for McArthur's eventual downfall was laid during this time of community activism. The persistence of the village residents ensured that the files on the missing men were never truly cold. They kept the pressure on the police, the media, and the city government. They refused to accept the voluntary departure narrative. They knew their friends, and they knew that men like Skanda wouldn't leave their dogs, and men like Abdulbasir wouldn't abandon their families. Their cry was a demand for justice that eventually became too loud to ignore. As the gardener continued to tend to his hidden harvest in the planters of Mallory Crescent, the world around him was slowly, agonizingly beginning to change. The systemic biases that had protected him were being challenged. The arrival of new technology and more sophisticated digital forensics would eventually provide the tools needed to see through his camouflage. But for now, in the mid-2000s, the village remained a place of mourning and mystery. The community's cry was a lonely sound in a city that wasn't yet ready to hear it, a warning that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look the most like us. The wall of silence surrounding the disappearances in the village finally began to crumble in late 2017, not because the system had suddenly found its conscience, but because the killer had finally made a mistake in the digital age. On June 26, 2017, Andrew Kinsman, a 49-year-old community activist and former bartender, vanished. Unlike many of McArthur's previous victims, Kinsman was a man of significant social standing within the village. He had a large network of friends, a steady job, and a reputation for being incredibly reliable. When he didn't show up for work or check in with his neighbors, the alarm was raised almost instantly. This time, the decided to move away narrative wouldn't stick. The community's pressure reached a fever pitch, forcing the Toronto police to launch a new task force, Project Prism. The investigators of Project Prism started with a clean slate, but they were standing on the shoulders of the community's long-ignored observations. They focused heavily on Kinsman's final hours, meticulously piecing together his digital footprint. Andrew was a man of habit. He kept a detailed calendar and was active on dating apps. In his apartment, detectives found a crucial piece of evidence, a single entry in his diary for the day he disappeared. Bruce. It was a simple name, but in the context of a missing person case, it was a lighthouse in the dark. While one team combed through Kinsman's records, another was scanning hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from the area around his home. They were looking for a ghost, a vehicle, or a person that didn't belong. Eventually, they found it. On a grainily recorded feed from a neighbor's security camera, they saw Andrew Kinsman walking toward a white van parked near his residence. He climbed into the passenger side, and the van drove away. The footage wasn't clear enough to read the license plate, but it gave them a make and model, a 2003 GMC Safari. This was the digital trail that McArthur hadn't accounted for. In the years since his first murders, the city had become blanketed in cameras. Detectives began a painstaking process of cross-referencing every white GMC Safari registered in Ontario with the name Bruce. The search narrowed down to a handful of individuals, but one name jumped off the screen: Bruce McArthur, the same man who had been interviewed during Project Houston years earlier. The surveillance on McArthur began in earnest. He was no longer just a background character in the village, he was a high-value target. Undercover officers followed his white van as he moved through the city, watching him tend to gardens, shop for groceries, and visit the same bars where he had hunted for a decade. They watched him with the knowledge that he might be carrying a body at any moment. But they needed more than just suspicion. They needed forensic proof. The breakthrough came when police located the white van. McArthur had recently sold it to a scrapyard, believing he was clearing his tracks. Forensic teams descended on the vehicle, stripping it down to the frame. Beneath the carpet, in the crevices of the floorboards, they found what they were looking for: microscopic drops of blood. DNA testing confirmed the nightmare. The blood belonged to Andrew Kinsman and Selim Eason, another man who had vanished in early 2017. The harmless gardener was now officially a serial killer in the eyes of the law. But the investigation was far from over. The police knew that if they arrested McArthur too early, they might never find the other men. They needed to know where the bodies were hidden. They continued the surveillance, watching him as he visited the property at 13 Mallory Crescent. They saw him move heavy planters, his movements practiced and calm. They realized with a jolt of horror that the artistic design company wasn't just a business. It was a mobile disposal service. The tension reached a breaking point on January 18, 2018. Surveillance teams watched as a young man entered McArthur's apartment on Thorncliffe Park Drive. Fearing that they were about to witness another Day X, the tactical team made the decision to move in. They burst into the apartment and found McArthur with the young man, who was already restrained on the bed. A black bag was nearby, containing duct tape, a surgical mask, and a syringe. They had arrived just in time to prevent a ninth murder. As McArthur was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of cold, silent indifference, the forensic teams began the grim task of dismantling his life. In his apartment, they found the digital trophy room, thousands of photographs stored on his computer and in the cloud. These images provided the map of death the investigators needed. They showed the victims in various stages of McArthur's ritual, and they provided the clues to where the remains might be found. The search of the Mallory Crescent property was one of the most complex forensic excavations in Canadian history. In the middle of a brutal Toronto winter, police had to use heaters to thaw the ground and the soil inside the large planters. One by one, the vessels were emptied, and the fragmented remains of 7 men were recovered. Later, an 8th victim's remains were found in a ravine behind the property. The scale of the horror was unprecedented. The digital trail had led them to a literal field of bones. This part of the investigation was a race against time and the elements. Every shovelful of dirt was sifted, every bone fragment meticulously catalogued. The detectives worked in a state of grim determination, fueled by the realization that they were finally giving names back to the ghosts of the village. They weren't just solving a case, they were answering a decade-long cry for justice. The digital trail hadn't just caught a killer, it had exposed the systemic failures that had allowed him to thrive. It showed that while McArthur was a master of physical camouflage, he was a novice in a world where every click, every camera, and every diary entry leaves a permanent mark. The investigation into Bruce McArthur changed the way the Toronto Police Service approached missing persons cases. It forced a reckoning with the biases that had allowed a predator to operate in plain sight for 8 years. It showed that normality can be the most dangerous mask of all. As the evidence mounted, from the blood in the van to the photos on the hard drive to the remains in the planters, the image of the village gardener was replaced by the reality of a cold-blooded, ritualistic serial killer. The harvest was over, but the scars on the community were just beginning to show. The legal proceedings against Bruce McArthur did not result in a long, drawn-out battle of witnesses. Instead, they delivered a swift, crushing weight of evidence that left no room for doubt. On January 29, 2019, the man who had meticulously cultivated a life of quiet normality stood in a Toronto courtroom and pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. This plea was a final, cold admission of the harvest of horrors he had conducted in the shadows of the village. The courtroom was packed with the families and friends of the victims, men like Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdul Basir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, Soroush Mahmoodi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lisowick, Selim Essen, and Andrew Kinsman. For many, it was the first time they were seeing the man who had turned their loved ones into names on a forensic manifest. The sentencing hearing revealed the true depth of McArthur's depravity. The prosecution detailed how he had used the properties of his wealthy clients to dispose of the remains, specifically focusing on the planters at 13 Mallory Crescent. The forensic recovery had been a monumental task, involving the sifting of tons of soil to find thousands of bone fragments. It was a macabre puzzle where the pieces were the literal, shattered lives of his victims. The court heard how McArthur had kept digital trophies, organized folders of photographs showing the men in the moments after their deaths, often posed in a fur-lined coat that became a haunting signature of his crimes. This wasn't just murder, it was a ritualistic obsession with power and possession. The impact statements from the families were a chorus of shouted desperation and profound grief. They spoke of the years spent in a limbo of uncertainty, wondering if their sons and brothers had abandoned them or if something terrible had happened. The sister of Andrew Kinsman described the black hole his disappearance had left in the community, while the family of Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, an asylum seeker who had fled violence in Sri Lanka only to find a different kind of monster in Canada, spoke through tears about the cruelty of his end. These stories grounded the case in human tragedy, reminding the world that the men in the planters were not just statistics, but individuals with dreams, fears, and people who loved them. In February 2019, Justice John McMahon sentenced Bruce McArthur to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Because of his age, 67 at the time of sentencing, it was effectively a natural life sentence. The judge described the crimes as pure evil, noting that McArthur had shown no remorse throughout the process. The resolution of the case brought a sense of grim closure, but it also triggered a massive social echo regarding the systemic failures of the investigation. A subsequent independent review, the Epstein Report, highlighted how missing years of inaction and institutional bias against the LGBTQ+ and immigrant communities had allowed a serial killer to operate for nearly a decade without being caught. The harvest of horrors ended in a prison cell, but the legacy of the case continues to haunt Toronto. It forced a fundamental shift in how missing persons are investigated, moving away from the dismissive, voluntary departure assumptions of the past. For the village, the trial was a moment of collective mourning and a demand that their lives never be treated as invisible again. Bruce McArthur, the man who thought he could hide a graveyard in a garden, would spend the rest of his days as a number in a federal penitentiary, a final, silent end for the gardener of death. The planters at Mallory Crescent have long since been emptied, and the soil that once held such dark secrets has been replaced. But a shadow remains. The case of Bruce McArthur didn't just end with a life sentence, it left a permanent mark on the psyche of Toronto. The village gardener is gone, but the memory of his betrayal lingers in every manicured yard and every quiet corner of Church and Wellesley. He was a man who proved that the most terrifying monsters don't hide in the woods. They hide in our neighborhoods, offering a friendly smile and a firm handshake while cultivating a harvest of death. For the community, the garden's shadow is a reminder of the calculated silence that nearly cost them everything. It is a testament to the lives of 8 men who were almost erased by a system that looked away. Today, the village is more vigilant, its residents more connected, and the police are more aware that normality is often the ultimate camouflage. The flowers still bloom in the gardens of Leaside, and the sun still shines on the rainbow flags. But the city knows better now. We know that beneath the most beautiful surface, a darkness can take root, and that some gardens are never truly at peace. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.